I'm presenting a paper on what I call the hegemony of a plural ethnic group despite periodic elections in Nepal. So what I meant by that is, let me just start my. So in Nepal, there is a hegemony of a group, ethnic group called Caste area, which is around 35% of the population. So its hegemony is in politics, top leaders of major political parties, parliament and cabinet, judiciary, bureaucracy, security forces, and including what in Nepal is called mainstream media and academia, as well as mainstream civil society. So just to, and including in the business sector, the economy. Just one example, the ethnic group has, since 1990, when democracy was reinstated, all prime ministers have come from one ethnic group. And mostly within that ethnic group, there are four castes, and Bahun, or known as Bahun, or what is basically Hill Brahmin, occupy disproportionate public offices. So this is interesting since, periodic elections has occurred in Nepal, and there is a strong anti-incumbency trend. No plural or majority political party has retained its majority or plural position in subsequent election. So that means it's a good sense, a good trend that there has been alternation of power. And some literature argue that competitive periodic elections lead to democratization. However, in Nepal, despite reasonably free and fair periodic elections, Nepal has not seen democratization along ethnic lines. So my question is, why has democratization not occurred on ethnic lines in Nepal? Or in other words, how has caste area continued its hegemony even in democratic polity or when there has been repeated periodic elections? So another thing is the demographic puzzle, in the sense that the dominant group is only 35% of the population. So it is less than 1/3 of the population. And basically four groups, Hill Brahmin or Bahun. We have Brahmin in the Tarai also, who are known as Madeshi, but the ruling group is Hill Brown, then Kshatriya, which is 70%. Then there are other two smaller groups. So these are the ruling groups. Then other groups who are marginalized, indigenous nationalists constitute 36%, Madeshi 20%, Dalit 13%. So, and ethnic politics literature has pointed out that when there are repeated elections, generally what happens is after some elections, you get a sense of ethnic census as the electoral outcomes, when generally to a considerable extent, different ethnic groups begin to vote for political parties they are associated with or affiliated with. So that is what the literature says. But again, in Nepal, we don't see that. There has been, number of elections, 6, 7 elections, but even after that, we don't significantly one ethnic group continues to dominate, not only in different sectors in politics, state, but including in what can be called civil society, media, and academia. So how has a political group with less than 1/3 of a population managed to maintain its hegemony even in democratic population, democratic polity? So my explanation in this paper, there are other causes and other factors, but in this presentation, I look at institutional explanation of the hegemony. And I look at, my argument is, because just, going into demographic and democratic politics would not allow a plural ethnic group, which is less than a third of the population, to maintain its hegemony. My argument is the dominant ethnic group has established, instituted political institutions that has facilitated and enabled it to maintain its hegemony. So that would be my argument. And there are different factors that contributes to the domination, hegemonic domination. But here I'll basically focus on formal institutions, informal institutions, legal provisions, and policies that has enabled the group to maintain its hegemony. So let me just briefly talk about the new constitution, which was supposedly elected by a constituent assembly. And there are, in the constitution, some progressive elements. For example, a parliamentary system has been established. Monarchy was thrown out and a republic was established. So in that sense, these are positive aspects. So what we see in the constitution is on political, ideological issues, there are progressive elements. But when it comes to ethnic issues, there is exclusionary, status quo, and regressive provisions in the constitutions. And the interesting point is, if you just look at the constitution, one may not see the regressive, the status quo element, because in the preamble and at the initial pages of the constitution has included all the right words like human rights, reservation, secular state, socialism, and whatnot. So all the right words are included initially. However, in the subsequent provisions, there are exclusionary content. And I'll just give an example. For example, this constitution declares Nepal as a secular state. But in subsequent article, what it says is that the definition of a secular state is that the state will promote and protect ancient traditions. And what that means is, in a country like Nepal, where one dominant group has been dominating for 2 centuries, and the state is occupied by that dominant group, it has been interpreted to protect and promote Hindu religion in practice. So you have the right word, secular state, then but subsequently it has been qualified. And you can see this kind of trends, all the right words, but then they are qualified subsequently. So let me begin by just discussing some of the institutions, formal institutions. So let me begin by federalism. Nepal has adopted federalism, but it is a federalism that doesn't share power with different ethnic groups. So for example, there are 7 provinces, and out of the 7 provinces, Khas Arya is a majority or large plurality in 6 provinces. Only in 1 province, Madhisi are a majority. Otherwise, in all 6 provinces, they have been created in such a way that includes the mountains, that includes the hills, that includes even the lower Madhesi plains and so on. But the aim has been to make sure that the Khas Arya are demographically dominant, either a majority or plurality. And what that has enabled is, it has enabled the Khas Arya to get a majority or large plurality of seats in 6 of the provinces, in 6 of the 7 provinces. That's what we saw in the first election. And it also enables the Khas Arya to get a majority at the federal level. So basically what we see in the 7 province federal model is what I call a mono-ethnic federalism, whereby one group dominates 6 of the 7 provinces as well as the federal level. And basically, it has denied autonomous provinces to indigenous nationalities. who constitute 36% of the population, but are divided into around 60 different groups and so on. So, and this federal model was attained by denying or refusing other federal models. The 10+1 federal model was proposed by a constitutional commission, and during the first Constituent Assembly, it had support of more than 2/3 of Constituent Assembly members. But as I will make it clear in the last slide, this model was denied by not calling the full House of the Constituent Assembly and subsequently dissolving the first Constituent Assembly. So it has denied autonomous provinces to indigenous nationalities, but also the 10+1 model had envisioned a non-territorial federalism for the Dalits, the scheduled caste in India, because they are spread all across the country in Nepal. So then what we see is domination in politics has enabled domination in administration, security sector, civil society, and economic sphere. So this is one way of continuing domination. Then there has been co-optation through political reservation. And when I say political reservation, I mean Nepal has adopted proportional electoral method. So 40% of the representative in the provinces and at the center, at the federal level, are elected through proportional electoral method. And when you look at it, it sounds progressive. But if you analyze it, what you see is this has been a tool of co-optation and incorporation. For example, political parties are required to further divide the reserve quota along major ethnic groups. So this 40%, if a political party wins whatever sits under the proportional representative system, it has to divide along ethnic and gender lines, subdivide. And it looks good. I mean, it sounds good, no, in paper. Well, I mean, political parties are trying to include everyone. But what has happened in practice is it has enabled the Caste area-dominated political parties, which are on the top. The major political parties are led by Caste area. So most of the influential leaders belong to the Caste area. And it has allowed marginalized groups members to be co-opted at a lower level. Because what happens, I mean, you have joined the political party. Of course, you would like to get elected. And then you are positioned in as member of parliament, member of provincial assembly, and so on. And I say co-optation because the literature, including in India, Constraint Chandra's book on the Bahujan Samaj Party and Van Cott in Latin America has pointed out that this kind of reservation, political reservation, has allowed co-optations of marginalized groups. In India, the Dalits, in Constraint Chandra's case, in Latin America, the indigenous peoples. Because what happens is, according to them, if members of those those communities, Dalits, indigenous peoples, Madhesi, etc., if they form their own political party, and if they lead certain political parties, then they can ensure and introduce reforms. But when they are just, middle level or lower level political members of a political party dominated by other ethnic groups, they cannot, bring about reforms and changes. And that is basically what has happened. In Nepal, the political parties are dominated by one ethnic group, and the policies they introduce favors their own ethnic groups, and not to the voters who happen to be marginalized groups and their member of parliaments elected through proportional representative method who happen to be marginalized groups. So then there are legal constraints on marginalized groups. So Organization of Indigenous Nationalities have pointed out around 5 dozen discriminatory provisions in the Constitution. Similarly, Madhesi organizations have also pointed out dozens of discriminatory provisions in the Constitution. Women's have also pointed out discriminatory provisions in the Constitution. And discriminatory, in addition to the Constitution, there are other discriminatory legal provisions as well. For example, in terms of citizenship, in terms of, sending people for jails for allegedly killing cows and so on. Some of these, legal discrimination existed before the new Constitution, and they have continued with the new constitutions as well. And in citizenship, some of the discrimination has new discriminatory provisions have been introduced as well after the new constitution was promulgated. So the discrimination, this type of discrimination has undermined the rights of marginalized groups. So they don't treat marginalized groups equally. For example, in Nepal, people without citizenship certificate cannot own land, cannot get government employment, cannot get a passport. So just imagine how a person who has been living in Nepal for generations, but somehow has been denied citizenship certificate fares in Nepal. So this is just some example. Then exclusionary policy example. So this was some legal examples. I provided some institutional examples. Now, in terms of some policies, so in Nepal, it's a multilingual society. Around 123-25 languages are spoken in Nepal. Language groups are in Nepal. But education, including at primary level, is conducted in Khas Arya or Nepali language. So what that has mean is numerous reports have shown that among the non-native speakers, there is a higher dropout rate. So what that means is basically capability of the people has been, non-native speakers of the language have been undermined. So they drop out, and even they don't drop out because of the language barrier. They cannot compete equally and so on. And as a result, because even the media is and government offices are run based on the language, the native speakers, the Khas Arya dominate media, academia, and other professional sectors. Then civil service exam is also conducted in the same language, Nepali, supposedly, and not in other languages. So what that means is non-native speakers of the language cannot compete on equal footing. And additionally, even only the Hill Brahmin have been doing well in civil service exam, because what people say is in the exam questions, writing Nepali makes a difference, and people who learn Sanskrit, they are better in answering questions, getting better marks, and so on. So it has resulted in highly disproportionate recruitment of Khas Arya into civil services and security services. And because of those people, significant policy making and implementation bias continues. Because even when their intentions are not bad, their worldviews, their lifestyle, their priorities, and so on would be different from the marginalized groups. And when they govern based on what they think is the public good, it has harmed other communities, especially the marginalized groups and so on. And further, retired bureaucrats continue to serve in constitutional commissions, and most of these retired bureaucrats who have reached the top echelons of bureaucracy belong to the Khas Arya, and policy biases continue even in those forums and platforms. So politics of nepotism now. In Nepal, politics of nepotism, ethnic favoritism, clientelism is widespread. And I guess to some extent, this is similar in other South Asian countries also, but it's widespread in Nepal as well. And it has affected political appointments, including in judiciary appointments. So in Nepal, there is a term they often use as setting. So you set in such a manner that you favor your, ethnic group member, you favor your political party member, you favor your friends, family members, and he or she will favor your family members, and so on. And in such cases, who benefits? People who are in power, people who are in top bureaucracy, top judiciary. They end up appointing their own, kins, friends, family members, and so on. So castes are benefit disproportionately since they are in the position of influence. And because of this, there are intentional as well as unintentional consequences. And unintentional consequences could be, for example, just information sharing by people of power, a network using for posting in good positions, promotions, etc., etc. And protection at the time of facing problems, including alerting or saving from corruption cases and so forth. So this nepotism are very, this network are very ethnic, family, kinship, clientelistic network are very effective, and the same group has benefited. So because of that, now there has been economic benefits to the same group. So capital and wealth formation, public sector employment, including from unchecked corruption, whoever are in political power, political offices, in bureaucracy, in media, in human rights organizations, and so on. So, top, human rights organizations. Just to, alert you, in Nepal, even the human rights organizations are dominated by the caste area. So then government contract, etc., have disproportionately also benefited caste area, and some studies have shown that as well. For example, traditional trading communities have lost ground on business areas where government network is important. When you need to have contract, get the contract or get license from the government, then caste area has emerged as strong business players because of their network and so forth. Some studies have shown, anthropological studies have shown this. So vicious circle of ethnic advantages continue as economically well-off are in a better position to provide good education, capital, etc. for the children. So in conclusion, hegemonic domination in different spheres have thwarted reforms, diluted reforms pushed by political movements, maintained status quo, and even introduced regressive laws and policies. When I say regressive laws and policies, for example, the new constitution, it has debarred a lot of, around a dozen top positions for naturalized citizens. So earlier it was not there, but now it has debarred around a dozen, from prime minister to from province, chief minister of provinces and so on, around a dozen top positions. So it's regressive compared to the earlier constitution as well. And just to point out, what happened was, so how did they manage it? So I'll just conclude with this slide. During the first Constituent Assembly, if you recall, I said that the reformers commanded a 2/3 majority. So if the Constituent Assembly had continued, then it would have instituted, it would have established, it would introduce many reforms, major reforms, including autonomous provinces for indigenous groups, non-territorial federalism for Dalits. But what happened was this vicious circle came into play, vicious circle of state and civic society domination. So what happened was media and academia created a very negative narrative against the reforms. Just since I have some time, just an example, what they said was one of the most, heard phrase was federalism would bring about ethnic conflict, massive, large-scale ethnic conflict. And oftentimes they used to talk about Rwanda, give example of Rwanda, where around 800,000 to 1 million people died during the ethnic conflict, ethnic violence. But in Rwanda, there was never federalism. So the ethnic conflict did not occur because of federalism. But in Nepal, the media, academia, and so on created such a narrative that common people believed that federalism would lead to ethnic violence and so on. And then Supreme Court intervened and forced a time frame. It was a political issue. The Constituent Assembly could have, extended its, tenure, but the Supreme Court, it extended tenure of the Constituent Assembly for a couple of times. Then it said it cannot. This is the last deadline that you have to promulgate a constitution. So what that enabled was that enable the anti-reformist force to, cross the deadline and dissolve the Constituent Assembly. So then the speaker, hailing from a political party that publicly resisted the reforms, repeatedly refused to call a meeting of the full house. So everything was set. The Constitutional Commission had all, all the, provisions, all the things have been settled. All it was necessary was the full house of the Constituent Assembly to sit and pass by 2/3. And there was 2/3 support, but the speaker didn't, for around a dozen times he postponed the full house meeting of the full house. And finally the deadline crossed, so the Constituent Assembly was dissolved. And that happened, with the support of bureaucracy, security forces, leadership support the regressive forces. So what we see is, we see the vicious circle of civil society, including media, top human rights organizations, Supreme Court, judiciary, political parties, some of the political parties, and bureaucracy and security forces in thwarting the reforms. And then the second Constituent Assembly was elected. And as you recall, in Nepal, there is a strong anti-incumbency trend. So in the subsequent elections, the reformists lost the elections. The anti-reformists won the elections, and they pushed through a regressive constitution. A constitution that is regressive along ethnic lines and so on. So this is how plural ethnic group, which is less than 1/3 of the population, has been able to maintain an ethnic hegemony by establishing institutions that advantages it and disadvantages other marginalized groups. Thank you.